Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here and glad for the opportunity to speak to you today. I want to dedicate my remarks to all of my colleagues in the history department who seek every day to get their students to find meaning in the past. It is pretty noble work. I wanted to say a word about the music. I was so inspired by our last chapel on the topic of music by Mr. Humphreyville and Mr. Griffith that I just had to start with music today. I love the quote by Bono last week that said, "Music can change the world because it can change people." That song we heard is so moving in so many ways, and it coincides with what I want to talk to you today about. In part, it is about the world's religions and human virtues. That is, how should one live? What is the good life? You may know the man singing. That is John Legend, a favorite of mine, and he is singing, "Woke up this morning with my mind on freedom." Now, what's interesting about that song is that it was remade during the American Civil Rights era. The much older original song was called "Woke Up This Morning with My Mind on Jesus," and it was written at a very difficult moment. A gentleman by the name of Reverend Osby rewrote that song while in jail due to his participation in the Freedom Rides in the early 1960s. And he replaced Jesus with freedom in the lyrics to fit the era. When you add the images of the funeral of Martin Luther King to the backdrop, it is a very powerful combination of image, sound, history, and the moving example of an individual like King's service to others and leadership. But I want to talk to you today about the world's religions and whether they still have anything to teach us in our hyper-modern age with its digital pace, pervasive social media, and concepts like virtual reality and artificial intelligence. My talk is based primarily around a book that I've read and reread a number of times in the last 5 years. You see it there. It is called The World's Religions, Our Great Wisdom Traditions by Huston Smith, who you can see above. Put Mr. Smith, right? Yes, there he is. He calls the world's religions nothing less than the distilled wisdom of the human race and describes them as a great resource for ethical living and a blueprint for living the good life. Now, if we define wisdom as behavior based on past experience, this will give us a small sense of the importance of this wisdom that has been stored for all of us by the world's faith traditions, an amazing treasure bestowed upon all of us by the past. One can summarize the Christian tradition as centered around the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and the idea of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have done unto you. The Good Samaritan reading at the start of this chapel is an excellent example of this moral teaching. Another very powerful example of this is the life of Martin Luther King. I want to show you a video clip of Reverend King. It is actually his very last speech he gave in Memphis, Tennessee on April 3rd, 1968, the night before he was killed. He was actually in Memphis that day to help lead a strike by sanitation workers, that is, garbage collectors, low on the social scale. Many told him not to go, focus on voting rights and other civil rights. But late in his life, he was also increasingly focused on issues of poverty, even global poverty. He understood better than anyone in his era that justice, in part, was based on how you treat the poor in any society. You should also know that he was told that there were many threats on his life in Memphis.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Obviously difficult to follow with any words. But clearly he was the embodiment of courage, and I personally believe that his faith was a fundamental part of his courage and conviction. I want to believe that he was comforted and inspired by the scripture that said, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me." Huston Smith says that Buddhism is closely linked to Christianity in its care for others and in its great compassion for its fellow man. Smith talks at great length about Buddhism, but I'll give you one idea and then show you a brief video clip. As we all know and live, there's suffering in the world. Think greed, war, hunger, poverty. That's the starting point for Buddhist teaching. It understands that suffering is universal and claims that this suffering is caused primarily by the selfish desire for personal fulfillment. Buddhism, simplified here, argues that one can overcome suffering by compassion. At Berks, we have empathy as a core value of the school. That is the very same idea. So I want to show you a video clip of the Dalai Lama. As many of you know, an important Tibetan Buddhist leader today who travels the world with a message of compassion. It's a little difficult at times to understand him on the video, but I think he will leave a strong impression. Two important points about the video to make it meaningful. He will call it unbiased compassion. That is, compassion for everyone, not just your small social group. Also, you must understand, he'll mention attachment a number of times. Attachment is defined by Buddhists. Attachment as defined by Buddhists. Attachment is negative and to be avoided. It is bias toward a thing or person. And therefore, non-attachment is a oneness or unity with the world.
Now compassion. As I mentioned yesterday, I think yesterday, the compassion, sense of concern, of well-being towards one's own friend, those people who really show to you positive. That sense of concern is, as I mentioned there, biased. Actually, very much involve attachment. So as soon as attachment develop, that's unrealistic attitude, biased. And the biased, limited attachment often bring hatred. Clear? So, a compassion which we want to promote, it is unbiased compassion. That compassion, once we train, not only towards one's own close people, but also enemy. Because the biased affection or compassion mainly oriented other sort of action. Action towards me, good, positive, friendly. So I love them. These people harm to me, negative action towards me. So instead of affection, feel anger. The other unbiased compassion, not oriented their action or their attitude, but simply they are also sentient being or human being. They also want happiness. They also have every right to overcome suffering. So on the basis of that kind of awareness, then develop genuine sense of concern. That's unbiased, right?
No.
Unbiased compassion. Genuine compassion. Here, no attachment.
Maybe a little difficult to understand, perhaps not. But my favorite Dalai Lama quote is this: do you want to be happy? Practice compassion. Do you want others to be happy? Practice compassion. So Buddhist teaching seems to share with Christian teaching this idea. Christianity says, love your enemies, not just those who are easy to love, like family and friends. The Dalai Lama called this unbiased compassion. I'm fascinated by this parallel. The faith tradition of Judaism shares many of these virtues. Huston Smith said that one, among many of Judaism's towering contributions to the world, has been the paramount idea that there is profound meaning in history, profound meaning in human experience. We humans are so much more than organisms on a rock orbiting a burning mix of gases that we call the sun. Of course, I believe that to my core. It is the very reason that I'm a history teacher. My basic question to my students every day is, let's find some meaning in what we're exploring today. In a collection of Jewish wisdom called Ethics of the Fathers, there's a quote that I love. It says, where there is no wisdom, there is no reverence. Where there is no reverence, there is no wisdom. If you can think for a moment, apply that to contemporary American culture. So the clip I'm going to show you is called "The Joy is in the Struggle." Sounds like the American saying, life is a journey, not a destination. Kind of like the Aerosmith song, if you're familiar. Also, this idea of joy is shared by both Christianity and Buddhism. To Christians, they say they have the joy of the good news of the Gospels, the good news of Christ to Christians around the world. Liberated from all selfish desires, Buddhists claim they reach the blissful state of nirvana. In Islam, there's a central belief in the idea that peace and joy come from the obedient surrender to God. Hinduism shares with Buddhism a sense of the peace and comfort that can come through serious and ongoing introspection in order to liberate oneself from the hyper-focus in our world on the soul-crushing and mundane cares of the material world. This video clip is by Rabbi Landau from a synagogue in Baltimore, Maryland. He talks about the joy of the struggle to meet one's self-directed goals.
I mentioned on my blog, you're right, that the struggle through the mystery and confusion of life is really where the fun is at. And you're asking me, how can I possibly find the joy in that? Well, where do I find the joy? And I think the first step to accomplishing that is really a very radical mind shift. And if you can achieve this mind shift, everything else is going to fall into place. Most of us are focused on the bottom line. And I'm talking about the bottom line here. I'm not talking about financial. But we set a certain goal, and we measure our own success or failure based on, did we reach that goal or didn't we reach that goal? Now, I'll grant you that in a lot of areas of life that's necessary. But really, that's only necessary in the peripheral areas of life, but not in the essential areas of life. In Pirkei Avos, in Ethics of Our Fathers, it says as follows: Lo alecha hamalacha ligmar. It's not your job to finish the job, but you're not free to walk away from the job either, it concludes. Meaning, there's a lot to be accomplished in this world in terms of understanding, and in terms of our service of God. You're not going to manage to get everything done. But at the same time, you've got to constantly and continuously been putting in as much of an effort as you possibly can to get closer to the goal.
So lastly, Houston Smith says the world's religions share three basic virtues and three basic views of the world. He believes they all revolve around the virtues of love or compassion, or what we've called empathy at Brooks. Second, the virtue of humility. And last, an unbiased commitment to the truth. In short, love, humility, truth. Finally, Smith claims these three things about the way the world's faith traditions view the world. He says, and I quote, "The world is more integrated and connected than we imagine. Second, it is generally good and better than it seems to us through observation. And lastly, it is far more mysterious than it seems on the surface. It has an elegant order to it that is mostly hidden from human view. In the end, all the world's religions see human happiness as a good and achievable thing, and that's a pretty good place to end up."